in-person expert witness testimony today will provide a coherent sequence of evidence. We will hear first a political scientist's exposition of the important concept of, quote, state crimes against democracy, end quote, otherwise known as SCAD by its acronym. Within the context he provides, the next two witnesses will present evidence that the official expositions of what happened on 9/11 and of how the 3 World Trade Center towers were destroyed are fraudulent. In covering up a state crime against democracy, the 9/11 Commission report and the technical reports of the National Institute of Standards and Technology were, by these accounts, also compounding that crime. Lance deHaven-Smith is a professor in the Reuben O.D. Askew School of Public Administration and Policy at Florida State University. A former president of the Florida Political Science Association, he is author, co-author, or editor of 15 books on subjects ranging from political theory, the philosophy of science, and the politics of religion, to empirical studies of public opinion and of Florida government and politics. In addition to his work as a scholar and an award-winning teacher, Lance deHaven-Smith has held important positions applying academic knowledge to problems of public policy. He has been, for example, Associate Director of the Florida Institute of Government and Executive Director of the Citizens Commission on Cabinet Reform, of Florida's Local Government Commission, and of the National Public Sector Gaming Study Commission. In a sequence of groundbreaking essays published in peer-reviewed scholarly journals during the past 5 years, Professor deHaven-Smith opened up research into the field of state crimes against democracy, and he is the editor of the February 2010 special issue of the journal American Behavioral Scientist that was devoted to this subject. Quick correction, he was one of the contributors to that. 2 others were the editors. Professor deHaven-Smith will be providing a testimony on the subject of 9/11 and state crimes against democracy until we break for lunch at noon. During this period, he will also be responding to questions from panelists, and I will serve as moderator. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lance deHaven-Smith.
Thank you, Matt. Matthew Witt was the editor of the American Behavioral Scientist Symposium issue. I define SCADs as concerted actions or inactions by government insiders intended to manipulate democratic processes and undermine popular sovereignty. All I did was looked at Iran-Contra, Watergate, Plamegate, the manipulation of intelligence to get us into the Iraq War, and I said, what would we call this? What should be the name of this phenomenon? And that's how I came up with this concept, state crimes against democracy. It tells us a lot that we didn't have a name for it. These used to be called high crimes or treason, but those terms have lost currency, and so we had to invent a name for them. I'm going to use this concept to try to change, broaden our perspective on 9/11. We have an official account that this is a terrorist attack with no U.S. foreknowledge. There's a lot of evidence to cast doubt on that official account. Perhaps the most persuasive is the evidence, chemical, eyewitness, visual evidence of controlled demolition of the World Trade Center towers and Building 7. And this is something that you can see with your own eyes. You watch the videos and you can see the Twin Towers explode from the top down into dust. You can see the Building 7 collapse beginning at free fall speed, at free fall acceleration into its own footprint. So you see that and you think, well, there's something really strange here. What was more disconcerting in some ways is that this was not investigated. So you had the NIST study that did not even look at the debris for signs of explosives or incendiaries. That itself is a crime. It's a nonfeasance but it suggests that there's something to hide, that alone. And this raises this all raises questions about foreknowledge and complicity of government, and then you add to that the rapid transformation of the political process and the movement to preemptive war, something that has been illegal and is against our treaties, the United Nations Charter, and now it's official policy of the United States government. So we see all of this, and we obviously begin to think that maybe this was an inside job to advance a war agenda. I consider that to be the succinct statement of the counter theory. I don't mean to say that I know what the inside job was, who organized it, how it was done, but that, I think, characterizes the counter view of the official account. You would think Americans, especially, would be suspicious of the official account. But the U.S. political elite accepts it without criticism, silences and stigmatizes anybody who objects to it. And most parts of the public, at least large segments of the public, accept the official account uncritically. Now, other panelists will talk about some of the reasons for this resistance to suspicion. One is self-interest, another is nationalism, another is just the cognitive dissonance of all the things that are implicated once you embrace this idea. But I think that there's also a common sense argument against the counter theory, and the one that I hear pretty frequently, and that is they just wouldn't do it. American elites, public officials, public servants would not go along with something so treasonous. And if they would go along, they couldn't pull off something that complex without being detected. And if they could, someone would talk. It's a kind of a tendentious argument. It's like the story Sigmund Freud told about the neighbor who was accused of returning a kettle that he had borrowed, returning it broken, and he said, "I didn't borrow it, and by the way, it was broken when I got it, and I returned it, and it was in good shape." There's a straining going on in this disbelief, but it's a common sense kind of thing, and it's very widespread, and it's so this is in part what I want to take on today, this common sense view. It's based on assumptions about elite political criminality and the fact that we have so little of it. I'm going to try to explicate some of the assumptions being made. But that's what the state crimes against democracy concept allows us to do, is look at elite political criminality as a general phenomenon. That's how science corrects common sense. Common sense tells us the earth is not moving. Common sense says it's a crazy idea to think that the earth is spinning and flying through space. But science taught us that that's not a crazy idea. It is now our accepted view, our true view. It did that by conceptualizing and looking at a general phenomenon, planetary movements, and some other things that I'll talk about. I want to give a few examples of how science works like this. That's what I will try to do in a small way with this SCAD concept as a type of crime, and give you some ideas about what this type of crime looks like, and some things that we can see that were apparent, but we haven't really noticed. I want to say SCAD's not another name for conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theories are allegations, suspicions, and they're suspicions that public officials themselves do not endorse. And basically they're saying unless this is investigated and confirmed by an official study, then it's a conspiracy theory. The SCAD concept is a type of crime. The conspiracy theory is trying to get us not to talk about that type of crime, and that's what it amounts to. So by naming it It's an important thing to name it in the sense that it gives us something to be specific about and talk about without being spurned and turned away by the conspiracy theory pejorative label. Matt, in introducing me, explained that I had been involved in writing a number of peer-reviewed journal articles, and I stress that they are peer-reviewed. It is no easy thing to get things published in academia, particularly that are contrary to the mainstream view. You really have to make a good case. This concept was introduced in 2006. It is impossible without David Ray Griffin, Peter Dale Scott, Barbara Honegger is here, Laurie Manuel, Kevin Ryan. People have been toiling in these fields for years. And what I'm doing is looking at this kind of as a secondary person coming in here and saying, well, I'll look at the research done over here and done over here and done this crime, and draw some conclusions across these phenomena. But I do want to recognize how indebted I am to the scholarship in this area. I do have a couple of recent publications that have not gotten much attention yet. One looks at the Nuremberg war crimes trials and looks at the evidence that was used to convict and execute the Nazi war criminals. And I would recommend this article to you because what it shows is that the evidence was pretty sketchy. One of the primary pieces of evidence was a memo written in 1939. It was written about 10 days after a meeting that Hitler called where he announced his plans for aggressive war. We didn't have an original copy of the memo. We had a photocopy, a photostat. But that was considered compelling evidence of a conspiracy to wage a war of aggression. I think it's pretty comparable to the Downing Street memos. That again, you have secondhand information written after the fact. But I think if you go look at the evidence from the Nuremberg war crimes trials, you'll see that when it comes to high crimes, when it comes to these state political crimes, we have a different standard of evidence. And we have to, because these people have control of the judicial machinery. And they're experts in the law. They know how to hide things. So historically, high crimes have been treated as something that if you're really suspicious, that means there's something wrong. Where there's smoke in high crime, there's usually fire, and that's the assumption made. Another thing I'll mention just very quickly, high crime generally, historically, there was none of this plausible deniability stuff. If you had an underling who committed a crime, you were responsible. The buck stopped here. Now it's like unless you've got a smoking gun, you're not able or in polite company to talk about it. I also have an article, symposium issue in a journal called Public Integrity. This is the ethics journal for the American Society of Public Administration. And it includes government workers and so on. So the concept is getting out there, and I wanted you to know about these publications. I co-authored a good bit with Matthew Witt, one of the moderators, and I want to thank him for that. He was the editor of the American Behavioral Scientist issue that came out that had the SCAD concept in it and got this concept to a wider audience beyond public administration scholars. He and I co-authored, but it was mainly his work, a paper where he introduced the concept of the holographic state. And I recommend this concept to you. Basically, the idea is that it's like The Matrix, the movie The Matrix, that we live in a virtual world in many respects. And it's, to some extent, illusory. But every now and then reality pops in, like 9/11 or Hurricane Katrina. Something happens and you start saying, whoops, there's something wrong here. Well, there's a set of people, a set of agents who come out and restitch the web, the artificial reality together for us. And they suppress things like the 9/11 truth movement. So I think that's a very useful concept. I've got 4 main things I'm going to go over. One, a few examples from science. Some very simple ones. Then about how it's overturned popular beliefs, widely accepted, strongly held beliefs. How was science able to do that? And then I want to talk to you about popular beliefs about elite political criminality. And what I'm going to tell you there is that we look at these crimes. We do, all of us. So we have to strain not to look at these as isolated events. Whereas, as I'll show you, when we think of ordinary crimes, we always link them together. So there's something going on that we have to be cautious about. I'll then discuss some patterns in state crimes against democracy and show you some connections that are easy to see. Once you accept the idea that there may be connections between these crimes, they just jump out at you. You'll be surprised if you hadn't seen them before. And then at the end, I want to talk a little bit about 9/11 and some things that once you've looked at state political criminality and you've gotten a sense of how it operates, some things that we can look at with 9/11 that we might not have attended to sufficiently at this point. I'm also going to suggest some forensic sciences that we need. I think of science as a community activity. It's a collegial activity, requires a lot of people. They tend to organize themselves into a division of labor, and which they call fields. And that's what we need to do, I think, is create some forensic fields for investigating this phenomenon. Scientific discoveries. Now, we accept the sun-centered model of the solar system. But I want you to think, now, when somebody first told people the Earth is spinning and flying through space, what would you say if they said, why don't we fly off? What's the answer? Gravity. Gravity. Now, the person says, gravity. Now, can you show me this gravity? Where is it? Oh, it's invisible. Operates at a distance. I see. And I'm supposed to believe this thing exists. The only reason you have her even telling me about it is you think the Earth is spinning, which it obviously is not. So why do you need this concept? How did we come to understand gravity? Well, it was a simple experiment that was done. Galileo said that objects of different sizes and weights would fall at the same rate of acceleration. We had assumed that objects fell based on their weight. Heavier would fall faster. We were assuming the force that acted here was weight. And Galileo said, no, the force is a uniform force, the Earth's gravity. And it will operate the same on any weighted object, whether it's heavy or light. And he reputedly stood on the Leaning Tower of Pisa and dropped different sized cannonballs off the tower, and they landed at the same time. And people were stunned. They had seen things fall many times. All your life you'd see this. But they had always assumed that they fell at different speeds. And then when they were shown they didn't, it was an eye-opening experience. And that's, I think, how science works. The theory of evolution. How did we get to this? This was a shocking idea when it was introduced. The idea that all life came from some simple organisms and evolved in, and it was insulting, to say human beings evolved from apes. I mean, we had court cases in the United States in the 20th century about whether you could even teach that. So it was very insulting. How did we come to believe it? Well, one is Darwin showed us that if you look at animals in different environments, you see that they vary according to their environment. So if you look in a snowy area, you'll see the rabbits are white. If you go to the desert, you see that they're tan. So he showed us this over and over and over again. He also pointed to the fossil record. We had found fossils before. We didn't know what they were, though. And what Darwin said was this is evidence of the evolutionary path. And we went and found intermediary species between apes and human beings. We found the fossil record. So that was another thing. And it was something that once we knew to look, we could find, but until we thought about it, we didn't even notice. Darwin also told us there were things about ourselves that we could see evolution in. He would point out to audiences that most of us, if you feel behind the curve of your ear, there's a little indentation about a third of the way down. And that's, in monkeys, that's where their ear bends. Where they can, and dogs have a crease in their ear the same kind of way. And Darwin said, well, see, that you have that crease. You can't bend your ear, but you still have the crease, the sign of it. So he pointed out things that, we could have seen, but we would have never known about without the theory. And I think that, and my point is, that's how science works. It takes things that you can't refute and brings them to your attention and changes the way you see the world all around. I think of it as there are two types of discoveries going on. One, I call macro discoveries. This is where you have this big picture and you find things that fill in the blanks. So you have this big picture that says humans evolved and everything evolved from different species, simpler species, and you go looking for intermediary species. And when you find those, I call it a macro discovery, like filling in the puzzle. Micro discoveries are where you take the big picture and you go zoom down on a narrow thing, and you see something you hadn't seen before. So you see the objects fall at the same rate of acceleration. You see the little ear indentation. I'm going to talk about these patterns among scads as a macro discovery. There's nothing super about them. It's really kind of silly that we've not looked for these before. They're pretty straightforward. And then I will talk about 9/11 as some things that we might draw from scads to look at there as micro discoveries. All right, let's talk about everyday perceptions of elite political crimes. They're viewed individually and in isolation. JFK, John Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy, both assassinated in the 60s. Both brothers. Both assassinated while campaigning. Both shot in the head, which is actually kind of rare for assassinations. Most of the time they shoot you in the stomach, like Oswald, bigger target. But nobody looked at that as a serial crime. Nobody said, in fact, we don't say Kennedy assassinations. We say the Kennedy assassination. And what that means is the President Kennedy. And if you want to talk specifically about Robert Kennedy's assassination, you have to say Robert Kennedy's assassination. We don't use the plural. Same with the 2000 and the 2004 elections. Now here's two elections, both with the same kind of problems, bottlenecks at the Democratic popular precincts, anomalies in the electronic tabulation of the data, problems with the ballot marking, deviations from the exit polls, statistically highly improbable deviations. Both benefited the same guy, George W. Bush, and yet we don't think of those as serial crimes. Yeah, somebody's just said, I do. 9/11, we're looking at the events of 9/11, but we tend to not think of 9/11 as connected to the anthrax letter attacks. Now, even that's true, even though we first thought they came from the same source. But now we think, no, one of them was the crazed Bruce Ivins, and the other was the terrorist. Or that's how, I know we don't think that way, but that's how a lot of people tend to think about it. I call this incident-specific myopia. So it's a nearsightedness. I think of it as driven, we're like victims, we're like abuse victims. These shocking events are so overwhelming They loom large in our minds, in our perceptions, and we can't see them as if we were above and looking at a bunch of them. We can only just see the one and then see the other. I worked with a PhD student about 15 years ago, and we interviewed abuse victims, spouse abuse victims. And one of the strangest things to me was that they didn't see patterns in the abuse. Women would say, yeah, he kicked me, he shoved me down the stairs. And, yeah, he threw the spaghetti in my face. And you say, well, God, this guy's a maniac. No, dinner was late. So I think I think to some extent this myopia is a abuse response. So I don't mean to accuse us of being stupid or foolish or something like that. I think that there are reasons for this. But it is the opposite of the way we think about most crimes. If there was a man who married a wealthy woman and the woman died of a freak accident, and then he married another wealthy woman and she died of a freak accident, we would say, this guy's killing his wives. We would certainly suspect that. We would interrogate him. We want to know, where were you when she died from the freak accident? It would be our automatic response. The TV shows on crime use this constantly. They will look for patterns in crimes to identify the suspect. It's just a normal thing. It's criminology 101. And yet when we look at elite political crimes, we see them one at a time. Even when there are obvious connections, like the Kennedy assassinations or the 2000 and 2004 elections. Why do we do that? Well, I mentioned part of it is the abuse syndrome. Part of it, there's just powerful norms that prevent us from suspecting it. The fact is the political class ostracizes anybody who says these things. If you're an elite, good luck. You're going to have not many friends. If you're not an elite, good luck. You're probably going to lose your job or be shunned in other ways. The clearest example of these norms is the conspiracy theory label and how it operates. Now, what's so peculiar about the conspiracy theory label is it doesn't make any sense. Okay, the idea of conspiracy being an irrational belief, the idea in a conspiracy is a sound legal concept. We use it all the time. We prosecute gangsters in the United States for conspiring. We have a RICO Act. It's about conspiracies. Conspiracies happen. We know that. Iran-Contra, Watergate. So how can you have a concept that dismisses all conspiracies as improbable or impossible? It doesn't make any sense. And yet we do it. Not us, but people who criticize us. It's an un-American concept. You might say, well, Americans really trust their leaders. Actually, no. Americans have a long tradition of distrust of their leaders. And if you go look at the Declaration of Independence, you will see that it is a conspiracy theory. Yes, we're used to looking at the first few sentences that talk about inalienable rights. But if you read the whole thing, the bulk of it is devoted to explaining that King George is plotting to deprive us of our freedoms and liberties. And we prove this by showing a set of things that evince his tyrannical design. Things like making us pay a tea tax and inciting Indian attacks and slave rebellions. We go through this long list and we say, see, he's plotting against us, and that's why we have the right to overthrow him. So the notion that conspiracy theory is American is wrong. It's totally foreign to our civil culture. It also doesn't make any sense. It's an unsubstantiated theory of its own. When people dismiss conspiracy theories, what they're doing is embracing a coincidence theory. They're assuming that all these things, they didn't catch the hijackers getting on the planes, and there was a group of elites who said we needed to have a new Pearl Harbor, And yeah, there were all these war games going on at the time. And yeah, the buildings fell down. All coincidental. All coincidences. So what's going on is you have an unsubstantiated theory that's being smuggled in with this pejorative term. And finally, it's based on a false premise, this idea that someone would talk. Hey, Americans know you can keep secrets. We kept the Manhattan Project secret. That had 100,000 people working on it. They built 3 cities from scratch. One was the 5th largest city in Tennessee. This word never got out. Get this. When Truman became president, he was not told about the Manhattan Project until he had been in office for over a week. So we can keep secrets. We kept secret our decoding of the Japanese and German secret codes. That was kept secret all through the war. The idea that you can't keep secrets among large groups of people is just mistaken. We have done it. Where did it come from? Why do we, if it's it's nonsensical and un-American and smuggles in an unsubstantiated theory and is contrary to fact, where did it come from? Well, the reality is part of the pejorative association with the idea of conspiracies came from the CIA. There was a program, a public information campaign that the CIA launched in 1967 against critics of the Warren Commission. This is a copy of a document that was released in 1976 through a Freedom of Information Act request that talks about countering these critics. This dispatch came out in 1967. And what it told the CIA officers to do is contact their media assets. These were friendly editorial writers and politicians. Tap those and tell them that anybody that criticizes the Warren Commission is assuming there's a conspiracy. All the accounts they could put together in that one catchphrase. They also said that it looked like this conspiracy talk, that was the term they used, the conspiracy talk was coming from communist propagandists. Now this is in the Cold War. This is a real smear that they're putting on people who are criticizing the Warren Commission. Recently, we have a proposal for cognitive infiltration. Dr. Griffin has written about this, and I recommend his work on it. One of the men who wrote the article, these are Harvard law professors, and Cass Sunstein is now in the Obama administration. And they call for infiltration of conspiracy theory networks and groups to disrupt their dialogue. This is breathtaking hypocrisy. Understand that this is how the state thinks. They are saying they want the government to target citizens because they want these citizens to stop saying that that's what the government does. So it's really Orwellian. If they're inserting concepts, and I think that may be what is going on, we have good evidence that they inserted the conspiracy theory meme, the conspiracy theory concept. If they're doing that, I think we should be wary of their term, cognitive infiltration. That sounds a little innocent, you know. I'm just kind of looking into what you're thinking. I would call it linguistic thought control or subliminal indoctrination, because they're trying to insert terms into the discourse that bias the reasoning process in the civil society without us being aware of it. They do it all the time when we're aware of it. Like the war on terror, somebody coined that term, and so, you know, extraordinary rendition, harsh interrogation. They coin these terms all the time, but normally we're aware of it. Axis of evil. We're aware of it, and we can defend ourselves against that kind manipulation of the language. But this cognitive infiltration that they're talking about is where we would be unaware of it, and they would plant these ideas. So I think we should be very concerned about it. All right, let's look at SCADs. I've got a list of 19 SCADs. These are political crimes and tragedies. Most are well documented. There are only a few that have been officially corroborated. Watergate, Iran-Contra, Flamegate. It turns out that the only time the government investigates itself, my research suggests, is when you have Congress in control by one party and the executive by another. So we get Watergate, you had a Democratic Congress and a Republican president. You get Iran-Contra, you had a Democratic Congress and a Republican president. Before I go to that, let me just run through these. McCarthyism, that was just somebody making wild accusations to foment social panic and to gain political advantage. The Kennedy assassination, you know about. Oswald, assassinated 2 days later in police headquarters on TV. Yeah, it was always funny to me that was on TV, but they got the Zapruder film and sequestered that. It wasn't shown publicly until '75. The 1968 October surprise you may not be familiar with. This was when Lyndon Johnson was trying to make peace in Vietnam, and Richard Nixon, who was running for president, sent word to the South Vietnamese and said, "Don't participate in the peace talks, I'll get you a better deal." And they withdrew from the peace talks. So there was what Nixon was worried about is if they made peace, the Democrats would win. And he committed treason. This was an act of treason. Johnson found out about it because Johnson had wiretapped the phone in his plane. And Nixon was so incensed by that, he wiretapped me. What a scoundrel. Just a year or so ago, a tape came out in Lyndon Johnson's holdings that are periodically released. Our elites let us learn about these things 50 years after the fact. And a tape came out, and it was Johnson talking to the Republican leadership in the Senate and saying, "Do you know what Richard Nixon is doing? He's committing treason, and he's undermining my efforts to make peace." And the guy said, "Yeah, this is awful. We shouldn't be doing that." And he said, "Well, why don't you talk to him for me?" So this comes out that we know this was going on. This is well confirmed. Ellsberg, we had a court case on. And I say burglary, but they stalked the man. They attacked him physically. They tried to discredit him in a variety of ways. Wallace, you might think, well, Wallace, I don't know whether that should count as something the state was involved in. But I will tell you, Ben Bradley, the editor of the Washington Post, said when he heard about Wallace, this is in Woodward and Bernstein's book, All the President's Men, his first reaction was that was the ultimate dirty trick. Wallace was running as a third-party candidate. He was expected to get 7 states. That might have made it impossible for Nixon to get a majority in the Electoral College, in which case the election would have gone to the Congress, to the House. That was controlled by the Democrats. So it was a real threat to him. And so when Wallace got killed, it removed, anybody that ran against Nixon. I mean, think about it. John Kennedy was killed. Robert Kennedy was killed in '68 when he won the Democratic nomination. And then Wallace was shot and survived. If you had a woman whose first husband died, sick of his stomach, you would be concerned and feel sorry for her. Second husband died, you would be very concerned. Third husband died, you would exhume the bodies. And I think that when we look at these assassinations and the connection to Nixon is pretty alarming.
Nixon also organized the Warren Commission.
He set it up. He set it up. And understand, Nixon gets pardoned. We do not know all the crimes of Watergate. Nixon was pardoned for any crimes he might have committed. Now, what the logical thing would have been to do is investigate, prosecute, convict, and then pardon if you can't stomach a leader going to jail. But no, we pardoned him in advance. Who pardoned him? The guy who became president when he stepped down. I mean, go figure. The Reagan assassination is something of a stretch, but there are connections between Hinckley and the Bush family. The 1980 October surprise was the effort to keep the hostages from being released before the 1980 election. And Congress investigated that and decided that some of the principals had alibis. These alibis later came into question, but it was after the Congress had investigated it. And when they looked at Iran-Contra, they specifically prohibited going back and looking at the 1980 October surprise. You could only look at the new stuff. The 2000 presidential election, I wrote a book on that, and it was just full of shenanigans. 9/11, we're here to talk about the anthrax letter attacks. Wellstone, most of my suspicions about Wellstone's death are circumstantial, but it was a troubling plane crash, and the circumstances and the timing were suspicious. Iraqgate, I'm referring to the manipulation of intelligence to justify the invasion of Iraq. That was a far-flung conspiracy. That involved the Justice Department. There were memos written about the torture. If you go look at when we implemented torture, when we actually harshly interrogated, to use our phrase, it was in the run-up to the Iraq War, to the invasion. It was in the summer of 2001. And what we were doing was looking for bogus evidence of a connection, a confession, linking 9/11 and Iraq. So the Iraqgate, this is a far-flung set of crimes. The 2004 presidential election, you're aware of, there's still litigation going on about that. And one of the key witnesses died in a plane crash just not long ago. Very suspicious. And his attorney had claimed that there had been threats on his life. Very suspicious. The last one I have is the bogus terror alerts of 2004. We know about these because Tom Ridge fessed up. The word had leaked out in 2005, but basically what was going on is when the president's approval rating was going down, they would announce a terror attack, a threat, and his approval would go back up. And they did this repeatedly in the run-up to the election. So I have this list of 19. One thing I would point out is how many elections were tainted. Often not by just one of these scads, but by two and sometimes three. 64, 68, 72, 80, 2000, 2004. In 64, you had John Kennedy assassinated with Oswald, but you also had the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. This is one thing that goes on with these scads. They're done in a political climate. And with the Gulf of Tonkin, this was a provocation and an attack that probably did not occur. That Congress was told North Vietnam had attacked our ships. There was no doubt about it. We were in international waters minding our own business. So this was just complete lying to Congress about the nature of this thing. This was in 1964, in October, in the run-up to the 1964 election, and Goldwater was criticizing Johnson for being soft on the war. And so you suddenly get this congressional resolution authorizing the Vietnam War right before the 64 election. We had a similar thing with the 2002 congressional authorization to go into Iraq. That was pushed through Congress right before the midterm elections in 2002. 68, you had the leading Democrat assassinated and the peace talks subverted. In 68, 72, you have Ellsberg's stalking, Wallace shot, and Watergate. And Watergate, it's called a burglary. Do you know why it's called a burglary? 3 days after the Watergate people were arrested, Ron Ziegler, the press secretary for Nixon, came out and said, well, this was a third-rate burglary attempt. Well, it was a wiretapping. They were going back in. They had already wiretapped the offices of the Democratic National Party, and one of the wiretaps had quit working, so they were going back in to fix it when they got caught. So they call it a burglary. Well, it was a lot more than that, and there were a whole lot of these dirty tricks. What Nixon was doing was making sure whoever he was running against would be the weakest candidate. So McGovern gets the nomination. He picks as his vice president Eagleton, who's had electroshock therapy. So it kind of did in his whole campaign. 1980, 2000, and 2004, you're familiar with. So this is just on the face of it, I think one thing Americans don't do is just look at all the suspicious events that we have. Just lay them on the table and look at them all at once, as opposed to one by one. That's half of the presidential elections. Now, I've broken down. This is a bar chart showing how I've rated these in terms of the degree of state involvement, the confirmation, my confidence in that. Most of them are highly confirmed. We've got tapes, confessions, memoirs, the Gulf of Tonkin. You hear people say, well, that probably never happened. Well, if you look at the documentary, Fog of War, there's an interview with Robert McNamara, and he said, yeah, it never happened. What he doesn't say is he went to Congress and said it happened. Slip of the memory. But most of these are well confirmed. Some are mainly circumstantial, and I include 9/11 here. We don't have a confession yet. We don't have although the evidence of controlled demolition is pretty close to a smoking gun, but I'm counting that as not as strongly confirmed as some of these other things, where we have actual confessions and, in some cases, prosecutions. And then there's some that are speculation almost, that it's mainly circumstantial, but the circumstances are enough that if it was an ordinary crime, you'd be exhuming the bodies or something. So most are well confirmed. They're hard to confirm. The perpetrators are experts. They know what to hide. If you look at Hunt, McCord, and Liddy, who were the Watergate burglars, these former FBI and CIA agents, attorneys. You sign a secrecy oath. Daniel Ellsberg has spoken at length about this, that you sign this oath that you cannot reveal a secret unless the person you're revealing it to has been explicitly approved to receive that specific information. So if you're testifying before Congress under oath and they ask you something, you can perjure yourself to avoid revealing the secret. These SCADs, they're industrial level operations. If you look at Watergate, for example, this wasn't a couple of burglars. They had two people in the hotel across the street watching. They had one person to pick the locks. They had one person to photograph the documents. They had one person to wiretap the phones. They had a whole crew of people. And it was a highly organized operation. So the difficulty in convicting people on this is often they don't know what their role is. They know what they did, but they don't know where it fits in the larger scheme of things. You obviously know that the investigations are conflicted. And then the problem of pardons. Normal crimes, the way it works is you get the guy on the bottom and you threaten him with life imprisonment or whatever and say, but if you'll tell us who you were working for, we'll cut a deal with you. And you work your way up the chain of complicity. With high crimes, with SCADs, the president can pardon everybody. So they've got to keep the chain from going up to the president. If the president resigns, you've lost your get out of jail free card. So it undermines the whole investigative process. If we look at the tactics, the modus operandi, as the criminologists call it, the most common are assassinations. I have 6 here listed. I didn't include the anthrax letter attacks that were mailed to Leahy and Daschle because I counted them as a planned international conflict event, a false flag event. But if you had included them, there would have been 8 assassinations that looked like some kind of state involvement. So that's the most common MO. Second is false flag operations, provocations, misconstrued intelligence, sabotage of peace talks. So that's a common approach. These false flag operations are not that common. 9/11 stands out as being such a big, visible event and also immediately followed by the anthrax letter attacks. So you have 2 right there, which I think frankly is a signature. And I'm going to suggest at the end of my comments that it would be advisable for us to look more carefully at the anthrax letter attacks. Election tampering is a recent development, and the burglaries, which again is kind of a euphemism. But one thing I would note about this is if you look at these skills and tactics, they're skills and tactics of military and intelligence professionals. And actually, some other work I've done, if you look at the development of them, you'll see that they tend to correspond with what we're doing in the international sphere. So we have a series of assassinations in the 60s. John Kennedy in 63, Malcolm X in 65, Martin Luther King in 68, Robert Kennedy in 68, Wallace in 72. We have this string of them. Well, at the same time, we were assassinating leaders internationally. So my suspicion is that these tactics tend to migrate back in to our domestic affairs. But in any event, even regardless of the timing, you can see that the tactics show this imprimatur of intelligence and military skills. This chart looks at how well confirmed we have these SCADs and what MO they used. These are the highly confirmed, the medium, and the low. This bar, the green is election tampering, the tan is manipulation of defense or false flag operations, planned international events and burglaries. The main thing I want you to see is the ones where we have low confidence were assassinations. And the ones where they're low or medium were either assassinations or these false flag operations. So what it suggests to me is, yeah, they're less likely to come out, particularly when they involve murder and treason. They're much more frightening events for the people who participate in them. And I'm almost done with the patterns. If you look at the motives in terms of what these SCADs do, who benefits, what are the consequences, most of them, almost 2/3, affect war. They make war more likely to start or to continue or to escalate. Another, a little slightly less frequent, are ones that are just political opportunism. Rigged elections are common. So you have these 2 things constitute the bulk of what's going on. Manipulation for war and just pure old politics. Sometimes these things come together. You have a real witch's brew when they converge. So Watergate, for example, was connected to Vietnam, but it was connected to the 72 election, and you had a whole series of crimes. Oswald was just to conceal a crime. If you look at the assassination targets, what you notice there is that they're mainly presidents, presidential candidates, or U.S. senators, people who are directly connected to foreign policy. There are no justices of the Supreme Court, and these guys don't have security. One of our Supreme Court justices was well known for jogging through Washington, D.C., which itself is not particularly safe. But we have no justices of the Supreme Court assassinated, no House members until Gabrielle Giffords, although there was a House member who was killed at the Jim Jones thing in Africa. Guyana. But if you just looked at, if you had an assassination once a year and you said who was going to get it out of the 546 top officials in the U.S., the people most likely to get it would be the House members. So they constitute such a large majority of the public officials. And the odds of a president being assassinated would be very slim. The odds of two presidents being assassinated would be very slim. The odds of two presidents assassinated plus two presidential candidates become astronomically slim. So the pattern doesn't look like lone gunmen out looking for victims. It looks like people who are consciously targeting officials. One other thing I'd point out, if you look at the presidents who have been assassinated where we think the state was involved or have some reason to think so, they had vice presidents who were very close to the military and intelligence establishment. LBJ was very closely aligned with the military, and George H.W. Bush had been the director of the CIA. So that's a peculiar pattern. I think sometimes they pick vice presidents to be assassination insurance. Remember Dan Quayle? It's just a thought. Nixon said when Spiro Agnew, his vice president, was indicted and he resigned, and they appointed Gerald Ford to be vice president, and it's on the tapes. Nixon said, "Uh-oh, I got trouble now." Before, they wouldn't have impeached me because they wouldn't want Spiro Agnew to be president. But now with Gerald Ford, my insurance is gone. If you look at the U.S. senators, the only time they've been attacked is when the Senate has evenly divided. You had a one-vote margin for the Democrats in 2001 that changed once Wellstone was out of the way. So that's a peculiar phenomenon. The Senate would just be targeted when it's so closely divided. I'm going to pick up the speed here. The SCAD trends, this just looks at by decade, and you've clearly got a rising trend. But there's another phenomenon going on. If you look at the 60s and the 2000s, you have a war agenda driving these SCADs. When the Cold War ended, we didn't see any SCADs. So you got to think that these are deeply motivated by a military agenda. I also categorize the SCADs in terms of what scope, how many people had to be involved. And just quickly say that most of the SCADs early on were pretty isolated. Under the Bush administration, they became far-flung. If you look at Watergate, Iran-Contra, and Iraq-Gate, and just look at the trajectory of criminality, Watergate was basically a maniac, Nixon, wanting to get reelected. And he did implicate some other people and get them to go along with him, but they did reluctantly participated in that. He hired the plumbers because the FBI would not wiretap the news media. So you have people saying they won't go along. When you get to Iran-Contra, now you've got a part of the military and a big chunk of the CIA implicated. When you get to Iraq-Gate, now we're talking the Justice Department with the torture memos and the preemptive war memos. You're talking a big chunk of the military with its preemptive war, and the CIA, of course. So it's becoming much more pervasive. I think it's a frightening trend. Last thing I want to mention, some things about 9/11. It fits the SCAD pattern. I'm just listing some SCAD characteristics. Intersection of presidential politics and foreign policy. Obviously, the 2000 election had undercut the legitimacy of the Bush presidency, and that was turned around after 9/11. It furthered the war on terror. It involves military and intelligence skills with aviation and demolition. The crime scenes were investigated superficially. With the no check for explosives in the debris. The photographic evidence, the Pentagon, all the closed circuit TV videos were confiscated, and only one was released, which was of very poor quality. But there was also a set of photographs taken of 9/11, a helicopter flying above it. These photos did not come out until 2010. It took a Freedom of Information Act request through NIST to be able to get it, and they were really shocking because they showed so much dust and this kind of patterning that looks like explosives. There's a name for it, pyroclastic pattern. Tendentious analysis. When they had a problem with the Kennedy assassination because they could only have 3 bullets fired in the amount of time that they had. And yet they knew one had missed, so they had to, with 2 shots, explain how Kennedy got it in the neck and the head, and John Connally got it in several places himself. So they came up with the magic bullet theory, that it ricocheted. Well, we have the magic buildings theory. but it's this tendency to develop very tendentious analyses to deal with forensic evidence rather than look at the evidence and say, oh, geez, the implications of this are very significant. We need to follow it. Instead, it's like, oh, cut it short. The last 3 are the ones that I don't think we've looked at sufficiently. These events tend to have a lot of coincidences. They occur in clusters, and they involve some manipulation of our perceptions of the events. The coincidence in 9/11, I'm not going to go over. I've already kind of recited some of them. There are many of them. But we have a science that calculates the odds of coincidences. It's called statistics. And when you flip one coin, you get a head. There's no big deal about that. You flip it twice and get a head. The odds of that are the odds of getting a head once multiplied by the odds of getting it once again. It's 0.25. 3 heads, you multiply again, so it's 0.5 cubed. When you get to 10 heads, you're looking at the odds of 1 in 1,000. I did a list of coincidences for 9/11, and I've come up with 50 coincidences, which make the odds of that 1 in a quadrillion. So but again, the science really raises strong doubts about it. Oh, I did want to mention that we need a SCAD statistics. We need a field of SCAD statistics where people calculate the odds of these things. Steve Freeman did it after the 2004 election. He took the exit polls and compared them to the election returns in a bunch of states, and he found that you couldn't have had that in any kind of statistically probable way. That frequent deviation, particularly almost always benefiting Bush. But we need a whole field to develop around this. The anthrax letter attacks, there are a lot of holes in the Ivins case, but the main problem they've got is the silicon and tin that looks like it weaponized or increased the dispersion ability of the anthrax. See, this stuff was going through mail sorters and coming out of the envelopes and spreading. Well, that doesn't work with normal anthrax. You got to do stuff to anthrax to get it to spread like that. And there are real questions about whether Ivins had the equipment or the knowledge to do that. But more importantly, I think, is the evidence of foreknowledge of the anthrax letter attacks. This is a report from the Washington Post of October 23. And what it reports is on the night of September the 11th, the White House Medical Office dispensed Cipro to Dick Cheney and others in the White House. Cipro is an antibiotic to fight anthrax infections. Now, you might say, well, we were just doing that as a precaution. Yeah, but you didn't tell the Senate. You didn't tell the House. You didn't tell the American people. Why would you have given Cipro out in the White House and never told anybody else about it? George Bush's comment when this came out was, well, there's no question that the evildoers are continuing to try to harm America and Americans. Barbara Honegger's got a good article on this, and that looks at the parallels between 9/11 and the anthrax and the people involved and the suspicion. But I think, see, what you have to think about is, if you look at Watergate, you have this string of crimes committed. Well, they were all committed by the same people, the plumbers. So that's the way we should think of SCADs. When you see 2 or 3 of them occur together, it's the same guys. So go start looking for who was at the scene. Start connecting the dots. Almost done, right? Last thing. This is a very speculative, but I wanted to bring it to your attention. And that is the question of whether the 9/11 label itself was planted. There's something peculiar about this label, 9/11. Now, this would have been a top priority for people. If somebody inside the government arranged this, they would want it to be framed in a certain way and would have been thinking about this. So I don't think this is out of the range of possibility. If it's a planted meme, it may have the characteristics of the conspiracy theory meme, which was empty. It's vague, but it's emotionally charged. It's a conveyance of emotion, and it's foreign to the culture. If we look at 9/11, it's emotionally charged. It's connected to the emergency phone number 911. I mean, that itself is very suspicious. Do you know what George Bush, after he testified to the 9/11 Commission, he came out into the Rose Garden and spoke to the press, and he called it the 911 Commission. And I think that that's the connection that, if this was designed, was intended to do, and that it may have been time to be on that date to have that connection. 9/11 deviates from our naming conventions. We don't name holidays and events, frightening events, by the date. The only date I can think of that we have in America for a special date is July the 4th. But even that is Independence Day. Normally, we would name where the event happened, so Pearl Harbor, 3 Mile Island, or how it was done. So the anthrax letter attacks, for example, if we use that way of naming, we would call 9/11 the hijacked airplane attacks. The problem with using 9/11 is it elevates the historical significance of the event. It's, as Matt said early on, or Michael, that there's before 9/11 and there's after. And it immediately conveys this way of thinking. And I'm not sure, I'm trying to figure out why America overreacted so amazingly to these attacks. Even if you accept the official account, it's like, are you really going to start a new Cold War? Because that's what it feels like over this. If you say 9/11 changed everything, that makes some sense. But if you said the skyscraper collapse of September 1 changed everything, you go, I'm not so sure. The hijacked airplanes changed everything? No, not really. But the 9/11 meme, I think, it could be planted. That's my suggestion to you. I did track down the first instance where I could find where it was used. It was used in a headline and a story the next day, September 12th. And it draws attention to the connection between 9/11, the date, and the emergency phone line. And it says it was an aptly dated wake-up call. It's just odd that this came out so fast and had all these connections, and even the way, see, a lot of people were doing 9-11 or 9-11-01 or or 9-11-2001. And so, but here, the very next day, 9/11, drawing attention to the emergency phone number. These are the kind of sciences I think we should try to expand. I've given you examples of them. I hope that you'll join with me in doing these, and I appreciate everybody letting me use all their material for my theorizing. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. deHaven-Smith. Panelists, we will take questions now, and I'll just try as judiciously as possible to field you by name. We'll start with Herbert Jenkins. I think it's. I'm sorry. Okay. Richard Lee, please.
Oh,
This is Herbert Jenkins. I'm sorry. Sorry, gentlemen.
what do you, I have the microphone, so I guess I'm in control. Your history of SCADs gives a new meaning to the term American exceptionalism. But I'd like to question you about the strength of the generalization from these 18 other SCADs to the 9/11 SCAD. And I think that depends on, in part, on whether you think whether anyone who's considering this thinks there are characteristics of the 9/11 alleged government conspiracy which are not shared strongly by the other SCAD's incidents. I think you pointed out some in passing, but I'm asking you to comment on possibly unique characteristics.
That's a very good question, a very good point. And I do see 9/11 and the anthrax letter attacks as being unique and different, but on the same trajectory of development. This is like an organism that is growing. It's becoming larger, it's becoming more sophisticated. If you think back about the Kennedy assassination, that was a remarkable event, but it was primitive in some ways. It was a high-powered rifle from a distance, and that left questions about who actually did it. You see the assassinations shift to handguns up close after that. So I think that there's a tendency for these things to evolve, and that when you get to 9/11, that it is on a much larger scale. It's much more sophisticated, assuming it's a state operation. It's a false flag event, which itself is relatively rare historically. So yeah, but I don't think it rules it out as a SCAD. I think it fits. My hypothesis would be, yeah, it's different, but it's different in an evolutionary, advancing way.
I would accept that. I think that one of our purposes here is to keep people's minds open about the possibility of a government conspiracy. But I think that one of the obstacles for people entertaining that is the pervasiveness of the moral depravity or corruption of so many parts of our society, so many agencies, so many individuals, so many professionals.
Just a comment. I think that people could do this and feel good about themselves. I mean, as crazy as this sounds, look, they could look at it like there's going to be a nuclear bomb brought into the United States, left in New York or Chicago. We're talking millions of people killed. And we could have a small-scale event, relatively speaking, that could galvanize the public to take the actions that will be necessary to prevent that from happening in the future. So it's a trade-off of a small amount. I go back and look at the Kennedy assassination. They thought Kennedy was a traitor. They thought that he had blinked in the Cuban Missile Crisis and that he was selling out to the Soviets. And so We may look at these things, the state thinks differently. The state thinks, and it thinks immorally, but in cost and benefits.
Professor Jenkins, thank you. I'll move to another panelist and hopefully get back if you have further questions. Professor Lee.
Yes, my question is not as cosmic as my colleagues, but it might help elucidate some of your thinking behind the list of SCADs. I noticed one that's seemed conspicuous by its absence, which is the World Trade Center attack of 1993. And I was curious whether there was some thinking behind putting it in or leaving it out, and it might help us better understand the kind of criteria that go into these things.
You know, I look at the literature around it and try to make a judgment, but frankly, the 1993 one wasn't a big issue for me. I had not seen much. I have seen some material indicating that we gave them the bomb.
Right.
You know, others that are not on there. Martin Luther King is not there. Oklahoma City bombing. Some of these dropped out when it went through the peer review process. And people would say, well, that's a stretch. That's a stretch. And I would say, okay, I'll take it out. But I think what we're doing is arguing about it at the margins. That the core of it is accurate, and we can generalize from that about this kind of behavior.
Thanks. Yes. Professor Johnson.
Thank you. Remember, Dostoevsky wrote a book called Crime and Punishment. You've talked a lot about crime. You haven't talked much about punishment and remedies, and whether we have any opportunities to address these terrible issues of state crimes. In any of your examples, are there any pieces of promise for finding punishment and justice?
Well, Matt and I wrote an article on preventing state crimes against democracy. And what we said was, well, you may not be able to prove these. Maybe you doubt us about this. But what we need to do is put in place some forensic requirements. Any other crime, you know, you go out here and somebody gets hit by a car and the car drives away, there'll be a big investigation. There'll be inventoried evidence. There'll be witness testimony taken. Do you realize that when Kennedy was assassinated or when 9/11 happened, the investigative procedures were invented on the spot? What I would like to see us do is mandate citizen juries. No more of these insider commissions where everybody's conflicted because they've got something to gain or lose. I want to require independent professional investigation of the evidence itself. So NIST is a government agency. Somehow you have to figure out a way to create independence. The closest thing we've come to it is juries, is just regular, ordinary citizens. They are not as easily bamboozled as a bunch of sophisticated lawyers, apparently. If you look at the ones that have been officially investigated, Watergate, Iran-Contra, and Iraq or Plamegate, what that shows is the biggest barrier we have to dealing with this is the pardon power. Because in every case, the culprit was pardoned. And as I indicated, that makes it hard to investigate and get confessions because people think they're going to get out of it. Another thing I would point our attention to is the Nuremberg war crimes trials as an example. And I mentioned a couple of things about it. One, I've already mentioned the evidence was at a lower standard. We took circumstantial evidence seriously because we assumed that these people had control of the administrative and investigative machinery. Well, I don't want to get too far off into the Nuremberg war crimes trials, but I would point out that we did not simply try the politicians. We also tried journalists. Julius Streicher was convicted and executed for participation in a plan to commit a war of aggression, for fomenting anti-Semitism and stirring up a war fever. And I think that that's something that we have to think about. We, in the United States, the only profession that's constitutionally protected is the press. In our Bill of Rights, it is specifically mentioned and protected. And that incurs a responsibility, it seems to me. So I would, I wish I had a better answer to your question. I've given it some thought. I'm not terribly optimistic about it. One other thing I would mention, Bertrand Russell's tribunal that he called, I think it was in 67 or so, it was on the Vietnam War. And he said, he was a famous philosopher, British philosopher, and he said, well, the state is incapable of prosecuting these kinds of war crimes that were going on in Vietnam. And the public is incapable of coalescing and articulating itself. So what we have to have are civil society groups and investigations, which it seems to me the Toronto hearings are much in that tradition. And I haven't seen anybody improve on Russell's analysis of it. But it leaves us with a huge burden, to say the least.
Thanks, Lance. Your Honor, in Pasamato, you had your hand up.
Yes. I have to ask you if the state crime against democracy can be committed by more than one state. For example, the Nigergate has been invented by CIA with the support of Italian and English Secret Service. Since the end of 2000, that we assessed in Italy. This is the first question. The second is that if you think that the fact that the state crime against democracy often is unpunished is a consequence of the lack of independence of the justice from the political power, like United States, where the general prosecutor, who is paralyzed during the investigation against the complot, is appointed by the president of the republic.
Yeah, yes to both questions. One is, can they be committed by internet? I agree. They are. In fact, one of the people who left the British intelligence service claims that it is routine for one service to call upon another service to commit crimes in their country because they are barred from it. We commit crimes all over the world every day with our intelligence apparatus. So we can get them to return the favor, come into our country, and you can break our laws with impunity. So I think that happens. I haven't studied it. I think it needs to be studied. It's certainly, I would think, of growing significance. In terms of getting these crimes punished, the president having control of the appointment. I believe that professionals adequately socialized to strive for justice and truth would do this. But we have political interference at this point at the highest levels, so it becomes virtually impossible to get justice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a few more minutes. Any further questions, panelists? Yes, sir. Professor Lee.
I'm glad the Nuremberg trial analogy came up because it's interesting that just yesterday or the day before, Noam Chomsky wrote a piece about the Nuremberg trials, in which he argued, conspicuously leaving 9/11 itself out of the picture, that the crimes committed by the U.S. in Iraq and Afghanistan constituted crimes which would be chargeable under the Nuremberg laws, and he quotes Robert Jackson's famous definition. And so I thought you might be.
That's
exactly,
and that's what this article I wrote in Contemporary Politics said. It looked at Nuremberg, and what people think about Nuremberg. The first charge in the indictment was a plan to commit a war of aggression, and they say, well, that means we did that in Iraq. Well, it's more complicated than that. In the Nuremberg trials, they said not simply that there was a plot to commit a war of aggression, but that they hijacked the parliamentary government. And they did it by setting fire to the Reichstag and by doing false flag military attacks from Poland. They had testimony on this. The evidence was sketchy, but they were convinced and they convicted people of this charge. That is, it seems to me, if you want to make the charge against, for war crimes, war of aggression in Iraq and Afghanistan, that to fill in the charge, you have to say, well, the government was hijacked. This was not a properly executed policy. This was a policy where the people involved in gaining our approval manipulated the process, lied to us, manipulated, scared us real badly, gave us provocations. And so I think if there's any kind of war crimes trials about Iraq and Afghanistan, that it definitely needs to raise the issue of 9/11.
Your Honor, you had your hand up. Your Honor, in Pasamonte. Yes, sir.
Richard Clarke, the former White House, recently told French-German television that CIA was aware about the imminent attack September 11.
Could you move the microphone closer? Thank you.
He told that the White House was not informed. I ask you, do you think that CIA could have hacked in this way without the knowledge of the United States administration?
I don't think so. The CIA is the only agency in the intelligence apparatus that reports directly to the White House. All the other agencies are part of, like the Justice Department or some other Department of Defense. CIA goes directly to the president, which itself is a scary idea.
It's a lie, big lie.
So I think, well, you know, to be frank, when I read Richard Clarke's opinion, I assumed that, yeah, he was getting onto something about the head of the CIA being aware that there was people in the United States that were planning to hijack planes and fly them into buildings. But I thought it was what Woodward and Bernstein called a limited hangout. This is where you fess up to something, but it's only to keep from getting at something a whole lot worse. And what they're saying is, well, yeah, the CIA, they knew about it, they didn't tell the White House. Well, worse may be that the White House knew. Worse may be, not only did the White House know, this was part of a much larger operation that was, the way some of the crimes in Watergate were described is they wouldn't say, go do this. They wouldn't say, go break into this guy's office. They would say, you know, if we just knew about Ellsberg's psychiatric problems, we really need to find out about those. And then they'd be off and running. So I think that there's probably these kind of curious communications, and that may be what Clarke is referring to. But he's giving a very limited version of what is more likely the possibility.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We just have time for maybe one more question. Professor Johnson?
One of the excuses for failure to take action on 9/11 is kind of an excuse of malfeasance or failure to do what is expected to be done. Can the failure to take action that is expected be regarded as a SCAD?
Yes. I think of what I would like us to do is think about public officials having an obligation to the state, to us, to the Constitution. They swear an oath. They swear an oath to uphold the Constitution. And this has broad implications. The tendency to look at narrow, defined responsibilities is, I think, a mistake. I think that we need to look at, you need to be proactive. You need to be aggressive in handling your responsibilities. You can't say, oh, I didn't think about that. Well, you should have thought about it. And that's, in any other area of life, that would be the attitude you had. If your little children, when they don't put their clothes away, you don't let them get away with, oh, I didn't think about that. You say, well, you better think about it. If you don't, you're going to be punished for it. And we've got to begin to think about our own leaders in a much more aggressive, a much more demanding way.
Yes, sir, Your Honor.
Do you think that the Secret Service often are used by the political power in order to commit the state crime against democracy?
Yes.
And do you think that an obstacle to the search for truth could be the state secret or office secret, which the US administration several times raised to the Commission for September 11?
Yes. The question was, does the secrecy prevent us from getting at these issues, and do the politicians use these apparati for political and self-serving purposes? I'll leave you with the final thought. Howard Hunt was told by Charles Colson to prepare a plan to assassinate Jack Anderson, a newspaper reporter, a very controversial newspaper reporter. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy put that plan together. They were ready to do it. They viewed it as perfectly lawful. They considered Jack Anderson a traitor for publishing classified information in the newspaper, and thought it was fine to go ahead and extrajudiciously kill him. Now, the attack was called off, but what that tells you is that this apparatus is got a very strange way of thinking, and they follow orders, and the politicians are the ones that are in charge. So I don't think we have a clue. Look, what we've got are 15 to 20 examples where we're pretty sure we know what happened. How many things do you think we don't know about? I think a lot. And that's part of what we've got to do until we start studying this, calculating probabilities, searching for connections between individuals at the times of these crimes. Part of what science does is it invents observation methods, the telescope, the microscope. I want to devise a truth detecting device that we can run political speeches through and figure out when they're lying. Things like that. That's what we need. We need a science that really gets on these guys. Hey, thank you all very much.